The Arctic does not forgive. It does not bargain, and it absolutely does not care about your theories. In the late 19th century, humanity had conquered almost every corner of the globe. We had mapped the jungles of Africa, we had sailed the vast Pacific, but there was one blank spot left on the map, the top of the world. For centuries, sailors believed that the North Pole was locked behind a barrier of ice. But in 1879, a new, dangerous idea took hold. The greatest scientific minds of the day convinced the world that past the ice, there was a paradise. They called it the open polar sea. They believed that warm ocean currents punched a hole through the ice, creating a tropical ocean at the North Pole where ships could sail freely. It was a seductive lie, and it was a lie that would cost 33 men everything. This is the story of the USS Jeannette, a ship sent to find a paradise only to become trapped in a frozen hell for 2 years. A crew that fought against madness, crushing pressure, and starvation, and a captain who kept writing in his journal until his fingers literally froze to the pen. This isn't just a shipwreck story. It is the most brutal survival march in naval history. To understand why these men walked into a death trap, you have to understand the arrogance of the Victorian age. In 1879, the owner of the New York Herald, James Gordon Bennett Jr., wanted a story. He was a millionaire playboy who had already sent Stanley to find Livingstone in Africa. Now he wanted the North Pole. He didn't care about the dangers, he cared about the headlines. He teamed up with the U.S. Navy and bought a ship, the Jeannette. Commanding her was Lieutenant George DeLong, a man of intense discipline and faith. He wasn't a dreamer, he was a soldier, but he trusted the science. Maps of the time actually showed the North Pole as a blue ocean. The plan was simple: sail north from the Bering Strait, punch through the thin ring of ice, and sail all the way to the top of the world. On July 8, 1879, the Jeannette left San Francisco. The crowds cheered. The sun was shining. DeLong wrote in his journal that he expected to be at the North Pole by winter. He had no idea that he would never see home again. The reality of the Arctic hit them fast. By September, just 2 months into the voyage, the warm currents were nowhere to be found. The temperature plummeted. The ocean began to thicken into a sludge, and then into solid rock. On September 5th, near Herald Island, the ice closed in. Usually, ships get stuck for a winter and break free in the summer. DeLong prepared his men for a long winter, thinking they would be moving again by spring. But spring came, and the ice didn't let go. The Jeannette was trapped, not just for a season. She was frozen into the ice pack for 21 months. Imagine the psychological torture. For nearly 2 years, the ship drifted aimlessly with the ice. They were helpless passengers on a frozen raft. The ship groaned constantly. The crew described the sound of the ice pressure as shrieking, cannon fire, and screaming banshees. Every night they went to sleep wondering if the hull would snap in half. And then the sickness started. The men began to complain of cramps, exhaustion, and confusion. It wasn't just the cold, it was the ship itself. The Jeannette was leaking, and the pumps had to be run by hand day and night. But worse, the canned food they were eating was slowly poisoning them with lead. DeLong watched his strong, healthy crew slowly turn into ghosts, but he kept the discipline. He held church services. He made them exercise on the ice. He refused to let them die. June 21st, 1881, the second summer arrived.
The crew prayed for the thaw. They got it, but not the way they wanted. The ice began to move, but it moved violently. Massive pressure ridges, mountains of ice 40 feet high began to bulldoze toward the ship. On June 12th, the final blow came. The ice clamped down on the Jeannette's hull. The timbers snapped like matchsticks. Water rushed into the hold. DeLong gave the order, abandon ship. They had minutes to evacuate. They grabbed their journals, their navigational instruments, and 3 small boats. They stood on the ice and watched as their home for the last 2 years tilted into the black water. At 4 a.m. on June 13th, the Jeannette sank. The 33 men were now standing on a shifting, floating ice sheet 500 miles from the nearest solid land in Siberia. They had no radio, no one knew where they were, and they had limited food. Their only hope was to drag their 3 heavy boats filled with supplies south across the ice to open water. It was a nightmare task. The ice wasn't flat like a skating rink. It was a chaotic mess of jagged ridges, slush pools, and soft snow. They had to harness themselves to the sledges like horses. They would drag a boat forward 100 yards, then go back and drag the second boat, then go back for the third. For every mile they moved south, they walked 3 miles back and forth. But the Arctic had a cruel surprise waiting for them. After a week of back-breaking labor, DeLong checked their position with the sun. He was horrified. They had walked south for days, but their position was further north than when they started. The ice drift was moving north faster than they could walk south. They were walking on a treadmill of death. DeLong made a command decision. He didn't tell the crew. He knew if he told them they were moving backwards, they would give up and die right there. So he lied. He told them they were making good progress. He kept them marching on nothing but hope and lies. For months they marched. They killed their sled dogs one by one for food. They were starving, freezing, and exhausted. Finally, the ice began to break up. They had reached the edge of the pack. They launched their 3 small boats into the open ocean. DeLong commanded the first boat. His chief engineer, Melville, commanded the second. Lieutenant Chip commanded the third. Their target was the Lena Delta in Siberia, a massive, desolate swamp where they hoped to find a settlement. But the Arctic wasn't done with them. A massive gale, a storm with hurricane-force winds, struck the tiny flotilla. The waves were 50 feet high. In the chaos, the boats lost sight of each other. Lieutenant Chip's boat was swallowed by the darkness. He and his 7 men were never seen again. No wreckage, no bodies, just gone. That left 2 boats. Melville's boat, faster and lighter, managed to ride the storm into one of the river's eastern mouths. They were lucky. They found a Russian village almost immediately. They were saved. But DeLong's boat was not lucky. DeLong's boat slammed into the ice miles to the north on a desolate, uninhabited mudbank. They waded ashore, carrying their dying comrades. They were freezing, soaked, and almost had no food left. They began to walk south, hoping to find a village, but the maps they had were wrong. The Lena Delta was a maze of frozen rivers and endless tundra. The journal entries from this time are heartbreaking. The men began to drop. First, Erickson died. They didn't have the strength to bury him, so they lowered him into a crack in the river ice and covered him with his own flag. They ran out of seal meat. They caught no fish. They began to boil their boots to drink the broth. They chewed on scorched pieces of deerskin scrap. On October 9th, they celebrated the 143rd day since the ship sank. Their dinner was a single ounce of alcohol mixed with hot water. DeLong knew the end was coming. He sent his 2 strongest men, Nindemann and Norris, to walk ahead to find help. It was a suicide mission, but it was their only chance. For the men left behind, the lights began to go out. October 21st, the journal reads, "Koch was found dead about midnight between the doctor and myself." October 22nd, Lee died about noon. October 23rd, we are getting too weak to carry the bodies of the dead. Eventually, they stopped walking. They made a small camp on the riverbank. They gathered around a small fire, too weak to gather wood. DeLong lay down. He placed his journal beside him. He raised his arm, perhaps to signal, or perhaps in prayer, and then the cold took him.
Engineer Melville, who had been rescued, didn't stop looking for his captain. He searched the frozen delta for months. In the spring of 1882, he saw something sticking out of the snow. It was a rifle barrel. He dug down and found them. They were almost entirely buried. DeLong was lying on his back. His arm was still raised, frozen in the air. The journal was safe. Melville found the last entry. It ended not with anger or fear, but with a simple list of names of the dead. The open polar sea was a myth, a fantasy drawn on a map by men sitting in warm offices in London and New York. But the men who paid for that myth didn't pay with money. They paid with months of agony, freezing in the dark, dragging a boat over the roof of the world. The USS Jeannette expedition is often called a failure, but in their failure, they proved the ultimate truth of the Arctic. It is a place where nature rules and human arrogance goes to die. If you think you could have survived the treadmill of death, let me know in the comments. And if you want to see what happened to the ship that tried to rescue them and vanished too, make sure you're subscribed. The Arctic has many more ghosts to share.